Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Hope all is well. So today I want to talk about measurement and variance, and in this discussion it's going to be more of an informal conversation where I'm giving you more of the nuts and bolts about measurement and variance, and then I'll go into giving my 2 cents about the strengths and weaknesses of this particular approach. Now, whenever we're looking at measures, there are various ways in which we can test the fecundity or the robustness of a measure. And one way is reliability, which refers to the consistency of a measure. And in other words, whether the results can be reproduced under the same conditions. And then you have validity, which refers to the accuracy of measure, or whether the results can do or really do represent what they are supposed to measure. And now we're going into, as we mature as a field in psychometrics and social sciences, we have this thing called measurement and variance. And it's not really a new thing. It's something that's been around since the late 90s, early 2000s. And the idea behind it is the question that's being asked is before we start conducting research across populations, whether it be demographics or cultural groups, it is a reasonable question to ask whether a scale or measure operates the same across groups. This is the crux, the essence of measurement and variance. Now, it's not literally the same across groups that we're looking at because, of course, when we are comparing groups, there's going to be differences. And in this case, we're saying that it's the same across groups in regards to psychometrics. I guess a better way to put it is, do our latent constructs have the same psychometric form across populations? So let's think of it that way, the same form, psychometric form across the populations. Now, the natural question that arises when I think about measurement and variance is whenever you interact with various different populations, whether it be race, ethnicity, gender, sex, or country of origin or culture, what we see is that there are going to be differences, and these differences do sort of like augment how we approach a situation. Like, I was an international teacher, and this was a question that was asked often is when we make our lesson plan, how in the world is it going to be interpreted by a different culture? If I'm teaching a group of students in Saudi Arabia, is it going to be interpreted the same way as if I teach students in Bangladesh or some other country? And in my own classroom, I would be constantly modifying things to fit the needs. I would have a lesson plan, a specific thing that I would be teaching, and all this sort of like activities and games, maybe if I'm teaching children and so on. But at the end of the day, I would have like a day or two, if I'm in a new culture, where I would just sort of assess the needs and expectations and the comfort that particular culture has. And then later on, maybe weeks later, I would implement some of the lesson plans that I have with the modifications that would be provided to make sure that it is culturally appropriate. Now, this is kind of a detour from measurement and variance, because measurement and variance is looking at ways in which to provide a measure that's more or less culturally appropriate across cultures, in the sense that not one culture has a clear sort of way of looking at the questions. If it was a questionnaire, if the measure was a questionnaire, and another culture does not have a clear way of looking at those questions, that would not conform to measurement and variance. That would be a violation of measurement and variance. And so, in this sense, what we're looking at is, if we have a measure, does it maintain consistency, and is there little to no bias between how one group is able to take and understand the measure, and another group is able to take and understand the measure. And ways in which we can conduct measurement or test measurement and variance is item response theory, and then confirmatory factor analysis. And after doing a literature review on this topic, the most common way is to test for measurement variance in the form of confirmatory factor analysis. Now, the early forms of measurement variance tests were conducted on scales that were translated into another language. Like, let's say you have a depression scale and you translate it into Spanish, does this scale operate or function in the same way as the original scale in the original language of English? But increasingly, as we see in the field and in psychometrics as a whole, is that reviewers are asking whether measurement and variance analysis across sex, age, race, and other features. And so that's where kind of how things are going, and this is the reason why we're doing the things that we're doing now in order to set the foundation groundwork for having this implemented in, I guess, the most user-friendly way. Because a lot of times, like when things are being introduced and people kind of haphazardly use them and don't use them properly, and we want to find a way in which they can be used properly and they can be understood in a way that less mistakes are being made. So ideally, you want to have a measure that looks clear from both populations, and a lot of times you're dealing with more than two populations. Maybe it's 5 or 6 or maybe 10 different populations, and so in that case, you really have to set the groundwork to make sure that each and every culture is able to understand the questions that you ask. And just for general information, this is going to be more about focusing on measurement and variance when it comes to questionnaires. And as I said before, the most common way is confirmatory factor analysis, and we're looking at latent constructs in this manner. So without further ado, before I go into the nuts and bolts about that, here's a reference list. And so the general guidelines, see, as I told you, 2000 was, or the late 90s was like when measurement variance was really talked about by various researchers. And by 2000, there was a review and synthesis of measurement variance, and it provides some general guidelines. And these are 2 peer-reviewed articles that you can check out and see the various more detail that this particular talk I'm going to have is not going to be able to cover. Now, there's also a book that has a lot more details about measurement and variance, and then there's a thing called predictive invariance, which we will not talk about today, but it's also a very important feature, and there's just so much detail, and I recommend you reading Millsap's book about measurement and variance. And then there are critiques, and I simply have a dear place when it comes to critiques, because I think that as any field develops, it does need that sort of back and forth pushback, and Wessel and colleagues provide that sort of pushback, and they really go in the deep end of deconstructing measurement and variance and providing their 2 cents on it, and more than 2 cents. It's very good arguments that they provide. And as a counter response, these other researchers provide arguments against their argument, and then Wessel and a different group of colleagues, or one different colleague and the same colleague here, Brunkirk, provide a counter response. And so as the field develops, there's going to be more of these, and hopefully it will go back and forth, and it will really help us improve the robustness of this particular way in which to approach psychometrics. So what is the first thing that needs to be conducted when it comes to measurement and variance? Well, it's a general thing when it comes to any sort of feature design of confirmatory factor analysis or latent variable models. What needs to happen is you have to go through data screening, and it's recommended to have a large sample size when you're dealing with measurement and variance. Now, the thing about it is, and this is the reason why you don't really see it, and I have yet to see an article where measurement and variance has been implemented on ant colonies or tribes of orangutans or other primates, is because we can't really get the sample size. And so you need a relatively large sample size. In this one study that I looked at, they had at least 200 participants for each subgroup, or subpopulation. And they had 6 subpopulations, and that was about 1,200 participants. So they had the numbers, and so they're able to test for normality, and later on the other sort of litmus tests that you have to go through in order to fulfill the assumptions, such as fit of the measure. And in this case, we're looking at chi-square. And I have this x right here in the -1 because